Welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. I'm Rebecca Elliott. While much of our attention has been on COVID-19 over the last few years, another pandemic has wreaked havoc on more than 200 species of wild birds. The culprit is H5N1, or bird flu as it's more commonly known. While not a new disease, its spread to migrating birds has seen substantial outbreaks occur in Europe, Asia, Africa, North America and South America. As this podcast goes to air, there's been at least one suspected case in Antarctica. Here to tell us why this could be catastrophic is Dr. Michelle Wille. Michelle is a senior research fellow at the Doherty Institute. Her primary research focus is on dynamics of wild bird viruses, including avian influenza. Michelle, thanks so much for joining me on Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you.
So firstly, what is avian influenza, and can you provide our listeners with a brief history of the virus?
Sure. So avian influenza is all the strains of influenza that are found in birds. In fact, it's actually believed that the virus originated in birds and spread to humans and other mammals later on. So within all these strains of avian influenza, we have a few further classifications. So one of them are these things called subtypes. So in the introduction, you will have heard H5N1. Okay, this just means it's type 5 of the HA and type 1 of the NA. And in birds, we actually have 16 different HAs and 9 different NAs, which form combinations. And almost every combination has been found thus far in nature. Now, most of these subtypes are classified as low pathogenic. That means they don't cause any disease in birds, and they're actually really commonly found in water birds. So if we go and sample ducks, we're probably going to find some of these strains. The ducks aren't sick, they're just continuing on with their happy-go-lucky ducky lives. This is in contrast to highly pathogenic avian influenza, and it's these viruses that we're talking about today. So essentially, some of these H5s and H7s have entered poultry production systems. And within poultry, they've evolved these high pathogenic phenotypes. That means they're highly virulent and they make birds very, very sick, and they often will kill birds. And so the virus we're talking about today are certain strains or variants of the highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1.
So with this highly pathogenic strain or strains that we're currently concerned with, how, when and where did it emerge?
So this virus in particular actually emerged for the first time in 1996 in a goose in Guangdong. And so the lineage we often refer to as the goose Guangdong lineage of highly pathogenic avian influenza H5N1, quite a mouthful. Now, since then, the virus has diversified and become entrenched in poultry, mostly in Asia. So it was never eradicated after it emerged. It just continued to circulate and it continued to diversify. Now, since then, a few really important things have happened, but the key one is the emergence of this sublineage or variant, if that's easier to understand, which is a terrible mouthful. It's called 2.3.4.4. So we use numbers like COVID, okay?
Yep.
So this virus in particular seemed to do better in wild birds. It was the first time we really saw this virus in wild birds at scale. The virus traveled with wild birds into Asia, into Europe, and it traveled with wild birds into North America. We then have seen some more fine-tuning of this variant, such that it's actually doing extremely well in birds. It doesn't need to go back and forth to chickens anymore. It can just stay in wild birds. And it's this 2.3.4.4b virus that has taken over the whole world. It's now found on every single continent except Oceania.
That's unbelievable. So what has actually been the impact of this virus so far?
Catastrophic. Absolutely catastrophic. So in terms of poultry, socioeconomically really important, we're seeing hundreds of millions of chickens being killed due to the detection of this virus. So obviously chicken meat prices, egg prices are increasing. It's also really big animal welfare for the poultry industry. For wild birds, it's just been absolutely awful. It's a trail of destruction. Colleagues from around the world are reporting seeing tens of thousands of dead animals just lying over national parks and wetlands. Some of the mortalities are so big that we're actually seeing population and species level impacts. So what I mean by that is 40% of all the Peruvian pelicans in Peru died in a few weeks. We've seen these 40% numbers popping up all over the place. And a huge variety of species. And it's not just birds. In South America, we're seeing outbreaks of this virus in marine mammals. So South American sea lions, more than 30,000 South American sea lions have died over 3 countries. And most recently are the reports of, I think it's about 17,000 elephant seals that have died. My colleagues have said that pretty much every single pup on the beach is dead. So there should be thousands and thousands of pups, and they counted only 58. So this virus is extremely, extremely devastating for wild birds and wild mammals.
It's completely unfathomable, really, when you
It
think
is.
about it. It's unbelievable. So how does the virus actually cross into species? So, for example, you talked about birds into southern elephant seals.
Yeah, so it does it through a few mechanisms. So I'll just start with humans because there are a few human cases. And in almost all cases, human cases are linked to live poultry markets or eating infected poultry. So most of these cases, or poultry workers is the other one. So very few cases, but it's people who are interacting directly with lots and lots of infected birds. For most of the mammals, so we'll just kind of park the marine mammals for a minute and we talk
Sure.
about the diversity of other mammals that have been infected. Most of them are scavengers or predators. So if you can imagine tens of thousands of dead birds in a landscape, it's an all-day buffet for foxes, coyotes, bears, raccoons, polecats, mustelids, everything you can think of. Okay, so most recently you would have seen that there's been a detection in a polar bear. Again, these are animals that are eating infected birds, and they themselves are becoming infected by eating infected birds. So for the most part, in mammals, it's isolated cases and it's just directly being infected by birds. The sea lions and elephant seals are a little bit different. So again, there is certainly evidence that they are eating infected birds. So there are some photographs in one of the publications that came out of South American sea lion with a dead cormorant in its mouth. So that's happening. The other thing that's happening is you imagine where sea lions rest. They rest on these islands that they share with seabirds. And often these islands are covered with lots of feces. Okay, so we can imagine that there's been lots of cases in birds. Their guano is all over these islands, and the seals are kind of rolling around in it, and they may be infected that way as well. Kind of the big question for us right now is whether there's mammal-to-mammal transmission. It's not been 100% confirmed that this is what's happening in nature, but the scale of marine mammal mortality kind of suggests that there might be something happening. But yeah, I think watch this space when it comes to that.
So how are these cases in wildlife detected?
Well, I mean, if we talk about the mass mortality, you can't really miss it. There's just loads and loads and loads of dead birds. And so it's mostly just kind of observers. It's not necessarily detected first by veterinary authorities. It's people who are out in nature and walking around that see lots of dead animals or animals behaving really weird.
Yeah, right.
Antarctica is a little bit different because we've spent a lot of work preparing and doing a lot of webinars about what to look for. We're actually seeing observers doing a really great job of detecting just 1 or 2 birds that are behaving a bit strangely, looking a bit sickly, or have died. And so we're doing a great job there of detecting the virus at really low case numbers, not just these mass mortalities.
So, but how do we actually know that it's, bird flu, for example, that's infecting them as opposed to something else?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the thing is that a sick bird from bird flu could be sick from other things as well.
Yeah.
So that's not for sure. So 2 things. One, if almost everything else has died from bird flu in the area and you have a sick bird, it's most likely that is bird flu. So that would be a suspected case. Mm-hmm. Confirmed cases are, of course, where we actually take a sample and we do a diagnostic, much the way you do a PCR COVID test. We're doing PCR bird flu tests.
So how is that done in the wild?
Well, samples get sent back to labs, of course. So for the most part, veterinary authorities are responding to outbreaks. They're collecting samples. They're taking them back to national labs and doing the testing. Antarctica is a lot more complicated because there are no veterinary authorities and there's not a lot of labs. So we think that for Antarctica, the vast majority of the cases will only ever be suspected because samples will never be collected. But in South Georgia Island and the Falkland Islands, they're doing a fantastic job of collecting samples. These samples are being sent all the way back to the UK and being tested by APHA. And the first genome sequences have actually been released from these locations as well. So they're doing a great job doing it as fast as they can. But the Falklands is very far away from the UK.
Yeah. So is there any way that we can treat these birds or other species in the wild?
So there is no treatment for this. So for poultry, the response is generally depopulation. Okay, so that's killing all the birds in an affected barn or an affected property. But for wild birds, there's absolutely nothing we can do. For poultry, a number of countries do vaccinate. This has had mixed results. Good vaccines are great. Poor vaccines can sometimes create problems. Vaccinating wild birds, I don't think is very feasible at the large scale, but there have been some trials to vaccinate special birds. So, for example, California condors, a really incredible species of vulture, almost went extinct, and there were just a handful left. And it took conservationists decades to bring the population back up. And of course, last year we saw a number of these birds die from bird flu. And so they're actually running a vaccination program for California condors in the US. And so this will be a trial for those birds, and it could certainly be applied to other special birds. You know, in Australia, we have some species for which we have only very small populations left. And so for species like that, we could consider vaccination if this condor trial is successful.
Right, that sounds fascinating. So, just before Christmas, you wrote an article for The Conversation which cautioned that bird flu could reach Antarctica. And unfortunately, there has been at least one suspected case there. What impact could this have on the continent?
Well, so we have a great fear for what could happen in Antarctica based on what's happened in the rest of the world. So, as I said before, this virus is leaving a trail of dead birds, dead animals. It's having catastrophic impacts on the species. And if we think about a place like Antarctica, many of the animals that live there don't live anywhere else in the world. Emperor penguins are only found in Antarctica, and they're absolutely incredible. Many of these species live in big groups. So emperor penguins, they all come together. You guys have all seen Happy Feet. You know, they all come together. They form these big colonies where they breed together. So that's kind of a problem if we're looking at a virus that's highly transmissible. So we could imagine that it would go in and potentially 40% of all birds would die or more. So that would have huge implications for the conservation of many of the species in Antarctica. The other concern is ecosystem level impacts. So if we take all the animals away from an ecosystem, well, then we start having really big problems of ecosystem regulation. And so that one will be really hard to demonstrate. It'll take us years to demonstrate that, but that is also a concern.
So, we're armed with this knowledge that, you know, bird flu is spreading around the world and it could, you know, be catastrophic for Antarctica, for example, in particular. Is there anything that we could do to mitigate this crisis?
You mean globally or in Australia?
Well, globally, or before it reaches Antarctica, for example?
So I think there's nothing that we can do before it reaches Antarctica. You can't stop birds from moving around. You can't stop animals from moving around. That's certainly going to happen. I think for us, mitigation moving forward is really important. So this virus came from chickens, it came from poultry, and there's still a lot of it in poultry. If we want to do something about it, that's where we need to start. We need to have better biosecurity. We need to really think about how we produce poultry. We need to think about how we control viruses, whether we allow them to be there or whether we eradicate them. We need to think about better vaccination. It's in poultry that we can actually do something, and that's where we should be working very hard. In wildlife, it's almost impossible to do anything. All that we can do is watch. It's important for us to count the number of animals that die, understand how it's moving through populations, but we can't mitigate that. At this point, there's very little we can do. So yeah, it's important for us to really think about what we're doing in poultry. And so, for example, in Australia, you know, these are things we should be thinking about here too.
So why hasn't it yet reached Australia and New Zealand?
It's $1 million question. Certainly, it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I don't think it's a matter of if. I think it's very much a matter of when it comes here. It's pretty much all around us now. We know that this virus has been detected in Indonesia. Indonesia is only a stone's throw away. So that's certainly something. One of the hypotheses is that we don't have migratory ducks in Australia. So the ducks that we have in Australia are endemic to the region. So that means that they may go as far as PNG, they may go to New Zealand, stay in Australia, but they don't go to Asia. And so these long distance movements of viruses have very much been facilitated by migratory ducks in some parts of the world. So I think that's been helpful. But the reality is it wasn't ducks that took it to Antarctica. And so that's a huge swath of ocean that was covered by some other bird, probably a skua, probably a gull, but we won't be sure. And so I don't think that's going to protect us forever. It's important for us to really do our homework, be prepared as much as we can, make sure our surveillance systems are set up, because it is likely to arrive here.
And is there any risk of it becoming a human pandemic?
This virus has been causing human cases since it emerged in 1996, but it is still very much an avian virus. If you think about the number of people that are exposed to infected poultry, there's only been a handful of cases. You know, all those hundreds of millions of chickens that are killed when the virus is in the barn, there are people that are being exposed to that, and it's just a handful of people that have been infected. So far, as of right now, today, I think the probability is low. However, these potential mammal-to-mammal transmission cases in South America, we don't know. That's quite concerning for us, right? Because we are mammals. So as what everyone is doing is that we're not panicking, nothing to panic about for human pandemic, but we are preparing and we are monitoring the situation very closely to make sure that we're ready in case anything happens.
So what is currently being done globally to counteract the spread?
Well, like I said before, there's very little we can do to counteract the spread. I think what we can do is work on poultry biosecurity. So what is happening is we're seeing wild bird to wild bird, but we're also seeing poultry to wild bird to poultry to poultry. So if we can take that part, sort of the mechanism away, then that would be extremely helpful. But yeah, I think reporting anything that you see is extremely helpful so we can respond. There is some work trialing impacts of removing carcasses from the environment to see if that's helpful in decreasing the amount of virus that is in the environment. Yeah.
So can you explain the concept of One Health and why it's important?
Oh, that's a great question because this is a One Health problem. So that's great. So my perspective, I come very much from ecology and wildlife. And so One Health is really the concept of not looking at the world through a human-only lens, but to really consider human health, wildlife health, or animal health and environmental health together. Okay, so avian influenza is not a bird problem. It's a mammal problem. It's a human problem, and it's the environment has also played a role in some outbreaks. So we really need to tackle this problem in thinking about all those things together. The reality is that the vast majority of human viruses have had an animal reservoir at some point in the past. Some instances it was a very long time ago. It may have been with domestication of animals. The animal reservoir is very important. And so for us to spend all of our resources and money and focus just on what happens in humans and forgetting everything else, that's what's happened in animals, and COVID is an excellent example of this, is a huge mistake. We really need to consider what's happening in the animal reservoir to better prepare and understand how viruses are ending up in humans. And One Health, so taking into account animals as well as the environment, is really critical for us to do that.
And what role can we as individuals play? Is there a role for us to play?
There is definitely a role for us to play, especially here in Australia. So in Australia, we haven't found this virus anywhere yet. We've been doing loads of surveillance and haven't found anything. But we're, of course, just a few people that are doing this work. There are so many people out there taking advantage of nature, bushwalking, enjoying their properties. And if any of you guys see any sick or dead animals, so particularly birds or marine mammals, it's really, really important that you report this. So in Australia, regardless of which state you're in, you can call the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline, and the phone number is 1-800-675-888. And just call them, tell them where you are, do what they tell you to do, and at least so that we know what's there. And that's our best chance of tracking this and identifying this if it comes here.
Thank you. That's really great that we can all play a role. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michelle.
Yeah, no worries, of course. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. That number again to report sick or dead birds to the Emergency Animal Disease Watch hotline is 1-800-675-888. That's 1-800-675-888. On another note, there's still time to enter the draw to win a signed copy of the book Life as We Knew It, written by Aisha Dow and Melissa Cunningham. All you have to do is suggest a topic for the podcast by emailing doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. That's doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au, and you'll go into the draw. Entries close next Friday, the 26th of January, and the winner will be announced on the next episode of the podcast on Friday, the 2nd of February. And be sure to go back and listen to the last episode with Aisha and Melissa. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please rate and review on your favourite podcasting app and subscribe if you haven't already. The Doherty Institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. See you next time.